New Mexico officials just got some help in their fight against toxic PFAS chemicals. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, recently granted Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's request to list 4 types of PFAS substances as hazardous waste under a federal pollution law. Environment correspondent Laura Paskus caught up with Secretary James Kenney of the state's Environment Department to find out why that one simple change could alter the dynamic with the U.S. military, which used these chemicals in firefighting foams and contaminated groundwater near Cannon and Holloman Air Force bases.
Secretary Kenney, welcome back to New Mexico in Focus.
Thank you for having me.
So we're once again talking about PFAS contamination from military bases here in New Mexico. Just to remind viewers once again, what are PFAS and you know, kind of what are the problems? Why are we concerned about them?
Yeah, so PFAS are a chemical that are typically used in firefighting foams, but they can be used in other household products, things like fabric protection. Think of your Gore-Tex clothing and things like that. Anything that's water repellent may have PFAS as the active ingredient that made it water repellent. But in New Mexico, the biggest problem that we have here is with the firefighting foams at typically our military bases. But the concerns about PFAS are growing every day as the science continues to evolve. It's clear that the health studies show that PFAS can cause things like high cholesterol. They can cause things like certain types of cancers, certain types of diabetes, and things like that. There's about 9,000 chemicals here, so it's kind of hard to say which one causes what. But generally speaking, they cause those kinds of health ailments, chronic and acute health problems.
Mm-hmm. So the federal government, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the agency that's kind of in charge of setting drinking water and sort of regulatory frameworks for states and tribes, they have not set an actual limit for PFAS exposure in drinking water. They have set a health advisory. How does that lack of a federal regulation make things hard for states like New Mexico?
Well, it's a great question, and it makes it hard because you don't know what a safe level is. And whether you're drinking water from a municipal water system where many New Mexicans get their water from, or whether you're drinking it from a private well, you can test for PFAS, you'll get a result, and hopefully it's non-detect, 0. But if there is a detection of PFAS, then the next question is, what's safe? And a lack of a federal standard for many years now has hampered states and tribes from determining how to work with communities to not only protect them, but enforce against those standards being exceeded. Fortunately, now there's some commitment to developing that drinking water standard under the current administration from the US EPA. So hopefully we'll see that soon.
So here at New Mexico PBS, we've focused a lot on groundwater contamination from Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base. And earlier this year, the governor petitioned the EPA to list 4 of these thousands of types of PFAS as hazardous waste under a federal cleanup law. Can you talk a little bit about that issue and how that affects or might affect New Mexico?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try to avoid using the legal terminology and just speak more in plain English. But the state of New Mexico, just maybe a little bit of a backstory here. The state of New Mexico asked the Department of Defense to clean up PFAS at Cannon Air Force Base under the hazardous waste rules of the state, which are the same as the feds. The Department of Defense said, no, we're not going to do that, and then sued the state of New Mexico to prevent us from doing that. That started in 2019. We feel as though, and EPA now agrees with us, that those chemicals, once they're in the groundwater, are a waste and they're hazardous. They're a hazardous waste. But we needed to petition the EPA to say, do you agree with the state of New Mexico And effectively, that's what we did. And clearly, the EPA concurred by saying that we're going to partially grant the governor's petition. And by partially grant, they just said we're going to do it for these chemicals, these 4 chemicals, as opposed to the 8,964 other ones. So that was a big win for the state, that the federal government, EPA, agrees with the state of New Mexico.
So what does that mean for like the Environment Department moving forward? What can you do that maybe you couldn't do before?
Well, I think what we could do before we did. And we said when a entity like the US government or a private company spills or discards PFAS on the ground, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's dumping of hazardous waste, pure and simple. The authority that has been concurred by EPA just further bolsters that we were right. And the Department of Defense is, I think, who really needs to understand that the rest of the Biden administration is now agreeing with the state of New Mexico, and they're the ones that are out of line with their interpretation of these hazardous waste laws. So I think the Department of Defense need to come in line with the rest of the federal government in the state of New Mexico and actually play ball here. I mean, this is where they do business. This is the communities they work with and in. These are the people they employ, and this is where their servicemen and women are. To say that they don't have to take responsibility for the waste that they got into our groundwater is absolutely ridiculous. No other entity in the state of New Mexico has that ability to do that, and neither do they.
Right. So PFAS is not, unfortunately, it's not just a New Mexico problem. Other states have these contamination issues as well. The EPA's partial granting of this petition, will it have national implications, do you think?
Absolutely. And since the petition was granted, we're being contacted by everyone from law firms to NGOs to talk about the national significance of the governor's petition and EPA granting that. And in fact, whether you're in Tucson, Arizona, who is struggling with their own PFAS issues in their drinking water, or you're in Michigan, with similar issues, the governor's petition kind of reset the landscape around the way New Mexico's position, or put New Mexico's position out there and gave other states that tool to say, hey, when you spill PFAS and disregard it and don't clean it up, that's actually a violation of state and federal law. Mm-hmm. So again, we opened the door for other states to follow in our lead.
The state released some study results recently testing 55 wells in Curry and Roosevelt counties for 28 of these different PFAS compounds. And I'd like to talk about this study a little bit because the results show that the levels in these wells are below this EPA health advisory we talked about. But I know that scientists recommend that you have no exposure to PFAS over the course of your lifetime. There's no safe level. So can we talk a little bit about what you found, which seems like good news, but also, what are people being exposed to?
So good question, and it is a little confusing, but that 70 health advisory level that EPA published, that's something we go by, but it's not the only thing we go by. And what we do in our department when we look at any PFAS test result, especially for drinking water, is we look at what all states have promulgated as their drinking water standards. So there's some pretty aggressive standards out there in states who have taken a leadership role to make sure that their drinking water is safe by promulgating low standards. So whenever we get a test result back, we first look at that 70, and then we say, well, how does it compare to other states, Vermont, Michigan, the list goes on and on. And what I can say about those 55, I think it's 55 test results that we received, not only are they below the EPA threshold, but they're below other state drinking water thresholds. It doesn't mean that the water is completely free of PFAS. I'm just saying that it is below those other state standards as well that are science-based drinking water standards to protect public health.
So this study, the the Air Force notified the state of the contamination in 2018, but it doesn't seem like we have a good sense yet still of where the plume is and how it's moving. To my knowledge, the Air Force has not done those studies, have not delineated the plume. Do these survey results help the state understand where the plume is and how it's moving?
Yeah, so we're not just relying on people's wells to figure out where the plume is and how quickly it's moving and where it's moving. We're also doing our own remedial investigation. But the results you're speaking of that are in drinking water wells, those do help us understand how quickly the plume is moving as well. So there's a lot of that integration of the scientific information we get from looking at the source area and then going out and looking at people's drinking water wells. And the drinking water provider in Clovis, EPCOR, is also monitoring their wells for PFAS. So we feel we have a good safety net, and we want to make sure that that plume is remediated before it hits any of those other wells.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about Holloman and, we've mentioned Holloman and been talking about Cannon Air Force Base. The Pentagon released a report more than a year ago saying that there was the potential for PFAS contamination at Fort Wingate, the Army National Guard armories in Rio Rancho and Roswell, the Army Aviation Support Facility in Santa Fe, and White Sands Missile Range. Has the state heard anything about these studies? Have you received these studies? Do you know if these studies have even been initiated?
Yeah, so what you're getting a slice or a view of with respect to the conversation we're having is some of the real targeted and most important PFAS work we're doing in the state with respect to those bases. But as you point out, it's not the only PFAS work we're doing. And in those particular sites that you just mentioned, we are working with different agencies, if you will, different organizations, to make sure that if there is PFAS at those locations, that we're aware of it and we're regulating it. And I can give you an example. As a result of what happened at Cannon, and then thinking about the Rio Rancho site that you mentioned, we're looking at all our groundwater discharge permits to make sure that if one of those facilities, like Cannon or the Rio Rancho site, if they need a PFAS limit or they need to do PFAS monitoring before they discharge or associated with their discharge, that they are doing that. So I think we have about 25 permits out of 700 now, discharge permits in the state of New Mexico, that have PFAS monitoring requirements. And the work we're doing with particularly the Rio Rancho site is kind of influencing that outcome. So we know there's PFAS, we're working to make sure that it's monitored, and we're working to make sure that those other sites are brought into the fold as well.
Mm-hmm. So there's litigation, there's disagreement. What is your sense of transparency from DoD? What is communication like? How do New Mexicans, how can we be reassured that important conversations are occurring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we publish, let me just always give you this information, that we publish all the data on our website. So as soon as we collect a sample and we have that information, we put it right on our website. So we try to make it as transparent as possible, and our different programs, our Drinking Water Bureau, our Hazardous Waste Bureau, we work with communities to help them understand the results, because it can get complicated. So we're working with individual communities, but all that information is on our website. The conversations that we're having with federal agencies like the Department of Energy, we had a great conversation with them about the mixed waste landfill at Sandia, saying that PFAS has become a concern since the time that landfill was put in place. And we want you to start monitoring for PFAS. And they're doing it. They're doing it right now. And those results will go up on our website. I think it's the Department of Defense that is lacking not only transparency with New Mexicans, but lacking communication with the Environment Department. I, as well as members of my staff, jump on their Zoom calls to give community updates of what they're doing on base, which is not what they're doing off base, because what's happening off base is nothing. That's everything that the Environment Department is doing and that New Mexico taxpayers are paying for. So you can rest assured that our department is trying to put as much information out about PFAS as possible, and we're having the important conversations with federal agencies like DOE, who's very responsive on this topic, and DOD, who is using the court system to not have the conversation.
It seems so interesting to me because from administration to administration, environmental policy often changes. We see that with the direction that lots of different federal agencies have taken, including the EPA, and yet on the PFAS issue in particular, the DOD seems to remain the same regardless of administration. I'm curious, is that normal? Do you see hope for DOD coming around to this issue of PFAS contamination and remediation in New Mexico?
I'm hopeful every day, and we're sending a letter to the Department of Defense this week saying that in light of EPA's clarification and an agreement with the state of New Mexico, that we would like you to do what we asked. And continuing to litigate against the state of New Mexico is unconscionable, actually, at this point. But I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll see real leadership at the Department of Defense that will say, we do business in New Mexico, we are part of the community, and we want to do the right thing. It's never too late to do the right thing, and that's what we hope the DOD will realize and give us a call.
And I just wanted to circle back to the EPA. We mentioned the health advisory versus a drinking water standard. EPA has said it's moving forward with its PFAS action plan. Do you have any sense of when EPA will potentially announce a drinking water standard, or how long it could take for one to be in place?
So under their recent announcement, which is now the PFAS roadmap, I think they're distinguishing the roadmap from the action plan because there's more movement now in the in their PFAS actions. But I don't have any great sense on when they're going to set a drinking water standard, but I'm optimistic that it'll be under 2 years. I think the urgency by which not only New Mexicans, but anyone from this country is dealing with PFAS demands that it should be as soon as possible, because we really can't wait. We need to get PFAS out of our groundwater, out of our drinking water, and treated in a way that actually contains it and doesn't just shift it to another, to the air, to the land, anywhere else. So I'm hoping it's sub 2 years, but I'm really hoping it's sooner than that even.
Well, Secretary Kenney, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.